There are gods, and there are men. And then there are those rare, troublesome creatures who walk the earth as men but demand the fealty owed to gods. They are the titans, the visionaries, the architects of new worlds built from sound and fury, and almost invariably they are monsters. In the grand pantheon of rock music, few figures cast a longer, darker shadow than the man they call the Man in Black, Ritchie Blackmore. For half a century, we have worshipped at the altar of his guitar, from the primordial, earth-shattering riffs of Deep Purple to the Baroque, soaring majesty of Rainbow. His fingerprints are on the very DNA of hard rock and heavy metal. He is the sorcerer, the gunslinger, the mercurial genius whose Stratocaster was less an instrument and more a conduit for lightning. But the light he cast was born of a profound and often cruel darkness. We celebrate the art, but we have been conditioned to turn a blind eye to the artist, to separate the sacred from the profane. Today we will do no such thing. We are going to peel back the layers of myth, cut through the fog of sycophantic praise, and confront the uncomfortable, unvarnished truth of the man behind the music. This is the story of Ritchie Blackmore's soul, a story I can almost guarantee he would despise you for hearing. It's a tale not just of musical brilliance, but of psychological warfare, of draconian control, and of a loneliness so profound it could only be expressed through the scream of an overdriven amplifier. What was the true price of his genius? And who were the casualties left in its wake? The answer to that question is far more complex and disturbing than you might imagine. This is the kind of deep, unflinching analysis we are committed to at PsychProg. We don't just skim the surface, we dive into the abyss. If you believe that understanding the artist is essential to understanding the art, then you found your home. Take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and give this video a like. It tells the great digital overlords that real, substantive content still matters. Now let us descend into the shadows. Richard Hugh Blackmore was a product of a grey, post-war England, a world of rationing, rigid class structures, and repressed emotions. Born in 1945 in the seaside resort of Weston-super-Mare, his early life was unremarkable on the surface, yet it was here that the seeds of his contradictory nature were sown. He was a quiet, withdrawn boy, often bullied, who found his voice not in words, but in the 6 strings of a guitar his father bought him at the age of 11. And here we find the first, crucial dichotomy. The instrument of his salvation was also his first weapon. He was not a natural. His father, in a moment of brutal but perhaps necessary honesty, told him that if he didn't learn to play the thing properly, he would smash it over his head. This was not a gentle encouragement. It was an ultimatum. Practice was not a pastime. It was survival. This foundational experience forged in him a relentless, almost pathological work ethic. While his peers were chasing footballs, Blackmore was locked away, dissecting the work of early rock and rollers like Gene Vincent's guitarist Cliff Gallup and the British maestro Hank Marvin, but also, crucially, immersing himself in the complex harmonies of classical music, particularly the works of Bach. He sought out the legendary session guitarist Big Jim Sullivan for lessons, absorbing not just technique, but a professional's discipline. This wasn't the romantic image of the self-taught bluesman finding God in a dusty crossroads. This was a cold, calculated acquisition of skill. He was building an arsenal. By the mid-1960s, he was a hired gun, one of the most in-demand session players in London, working for the eccentric and often volatile producer Joe Meek. He played on countless pop singles for artists like The Outlaws, Screaming Lord Sutch, and Neil Christian. This period was his crucible. He learned the brutal economics of the music business, the ephemeral nature of pop stardom, and the necessity of being better, faster, and more reliable than the next man in line. More importantly, he developed a profound contempt for the triviality of the pop music he was paid to play. He saw it as disposable, formulaic, and emotionally hollow. He yearned for something more substantial, more powerful, more real. He craved weight, drama, and gravitas. This simmering resentment and artistic ambition finally found its outlet in 1968 with the formation of Deep Purple. The initial lineup, now known as MK with Rod Evans on vocals and Nick Simper on bass, was a fascinating, psychedelic-tinged pop-rock outfit. Their cover of Joe South's Hush was a surprise hit in the United States. But for Blackmore, this was still child's play. He felt shackled by the pop sensibilities of his bandmates, and the organ-heavy sound dominated by the classically trained John Lord. Blackmore didn't want to be part of an ensemble. He wanted to lead a cavalry charge. The conflict was inevitable. He saw Evans as a lightweight crooner, and Simper as a technically limited bassist, unworthy of the sonic cathedral he intended to build. And so, in 1969, we witnessed the first true display of Blackmore's ruthless Machiavellian streak. Without their knowledge, he and fellow conspirators John Lord and Ian Pace scouted and recruited a new singer and bassist. The chosen ones were Ian Gillan and Roger Glover from the band Episode 6. The manner of the firing of Evans and Simper was cold, clinical, and brutal. They were essentially ghosted, discovering they were out of the band they co-founded almost by accident. There was no farewell tour, no golden handshake, just the cold, hard reality of being cast aside. For Blackmore, sentimentality was a weakness. The band was not a democracy. It was a vehicle for his vision, and any part that wasn't performing to his impossibly high standards was to be replaced, like a faulty spark plug. This scorched earth policy would become his defining operational method for the next 2 decades. He was establishing a precedent. Loyalty to Ritchie Blackmore was paramount, but his loyalty to you was conditional, temporary, and entirely dependent on your utility to his musical ambitions. The result of this brutal cull was, undeniably, spectacular. The MK2 lineup of Deep Purple, Blackmore, Gillan, Glover, Lord, and Pace, is for many the definitive incarnation. They were a band of staggering virtuosity, a 5-headed hydra where each head was a master of its domain. Between 1970 and 1973, they released a string of albums that are now canonical texts of hard rock. In Rock, Fireball, Machine Head, and the live masterpiece Made in Japan. The chemistry was explosive, both on and off stage. The interplay between Blackmore's guitar and Lord's Hammond organ was the stuff of legend, a dueling dance between fire and brimstone. Gillan's banshee wail soared over the top, a human siren against a hurricane of sound. This was the grand vision realized. It was loud, aggressive, intricate, and profoundly dramatic. Songs like Highway Star, Smoke on the Water, and Child in Time were not mere songs. They were epic sagas in miniature, but the same friction that created the diamond was also grinding it to dust. The relationship between the two frontmen, the flamboyant, extroverted Gillan and the brooding, introverted Blackmore, degenerated into open warfare. They were polar opposites in temperament. Gillan was a showman who loved the adulation of the crowd. Blackmore was a musician who seemed to resent the very presence of an audience, viewing them as a necessary evil. Their egos clashed like tectonic plates. On stage, they would try to upstage each other, extending solos, pushing the boundaries of professional courtesy. Off stage, it was worse. Blackmore, the master of the wind-up, would engage in a campaign of psychological attrition. His practical jokes were infamous, ranging from the juvenile, locking people in closets, hiding their belongings, to the genuinely malicious. He sought to create an atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty, believing perhaps that it kept everyone on their toes, that comfort and complacency were the enemies of great art. For him, a happy band was a boring band. The touring schedule was relentless, the pressures immense. By 1973, the fissures were irreparable. Gillan, exhausted and at odds with Blackmore, handed in his notice. Blackmore, in a move of astonishing coldness, demanded that Roger Glover, Gillan's friend and a universally liked, calming presence in the band, also be fired. His reasoning was chillingly simple. He wanted to sever all ties to the Gillan era, to wipe the slate clean. Glover was a world-class bassist and a crucial songwriter, co-author of the Smoke on the Water riff, for God's sake. But it didn't matter. He was collateral damage in Blackmore's endless war against mediocrity and personal discontent. Glover was informed of his dismissal by the band's management just hours before the final show of a tour. He played the concert in a state of shock, a dead man walking. It was a masterclass in corporate cruelty, orchestrated by a man who valued his own artistic trajectory above all human decency. This leads us to one of the most infamous and revealing episodes in the entire Ritchie Blackmore saga. It is the moment where the private tyrant became a public menace, where the simmering darkness erupted into a spectacular, fiery display of rage. It happened on April 6, 1974, at the California Jam Festival in Ontario, California. Deep Purple, now with new vocalist David Coverdale and bassist vocalist Glenn Hughes, were co-headlining with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The festival was being broadcast live on ABC television, a massive audience. Due to scheduling, Deep Purple were slated to go on before sunset, with ELP closing the show after dark. Blackmore, however, was adamant. He believed his band's dramatic stage show, complete with pyrotechnics, required the cover of darkness to be effective. He refused to go on stage. He locked himself in his trailer, creating a standoff that delayed the entire festival, infuriating the promoters, the television network, and the 250,000-strong crowd. Eventually, as dusk began to fall, he was coaxed on stage. What followed was not merely a rock concert. It was an act of primal aggression. Blackmore was a man possessed. He played with a ferocity that bordered on violence, attacking his guitar as if trying to exorcise a demon. Near the end of the set, during the climax of Space Truckin', his fury boiled over. He began smashing one of his guitars against a television camera that he felt had gotten too close to him. He didn't just push it away. He pulverized it, splintering the wood, the cameraman scrambling for safety. But that wasn't enough. As the band brought the song to a chaotic end, a pre-planned pyrotechnic effect on one of Blackmore's amplifier stacks went disastrously wrong. Instead of a flash, there was a massive explosion. The entire stack erupted in a ball of fire and smoke, engulfing the stage. It was a terrifying, uncontrolled detonation that could have killed someone. The band, fearing they were under some kind of attack, fled the stage. The truth, as it later emerged, was that Blackmore had instructed his roadie to douse the amps with petrol to create a more spectacular wall of fire effect. He had turned a rock show into a war zone. The band escaped the venue by helicopter to avoid being arrested by the fire marshals and confronted by angry festival organizers. Let's pause here and truly consider this. This was not rock and roll theater. This was not smashing a guitar in a fit of passionate energy, like Pete Townshend. This was a calculated act of destruction and endangerment, born of petulance and an ego that could not countenance being second on a bill. It was the ultimate display of his core belief. The world must bend to the will of Ritchie Blackmore. The rules of society, of safety, of professional conduct did not apply to him. It is a chilling portrait of a man on the edge. This kind of story is precisely why PsychProg exists. We look at these legendary moments and ask the hard questions. What does an event like the California Jam tell us about the psychology of genius and the corrupting influence of power? If you find this approach compelling, please, if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. Sharing this video with anyone who loves classic rock helps us build a community dedicated to these deeper conversations. Following the California Jam debacle, the MK3 lineup of Purple managed one more studio album, Stormbringer. Blackmore's discontent was growing again. He despised the funky, soulful direction that Coverdale and, particularly, Glenn Hughes were pushing the band in. He derisively called it shoeshine music. He had wanted to record a cover of the song Black Sheep of the Family by the band Quatermass, but the others refused. This, for him, was the final straw. It was an act of artistic defiance he could not tolerate. In 1975, he did what no one thought he would do. He quit. He walked away from one of the biggest bands in the world, at the height of its commercial power, because they wouldn't let him record a cover song. It seems a trivial reason, but for Blackmore, it was a matter of absolute principle. He could no longer control Deep Purple's destiny, so he abandoned it. He immediately formed a new band, one that would be forged entirely in his own image. With no competing egos or alternative artistic visions, he called it Rainbow. This was to be his kingdom, and he would be its undisputed monarch. For his first vocalist, he recruited the diminutive American singer with the colossal voice, Ronnie James Dio. With Dio, Blackmore found his perfect foil. Dio's lyrics, filled with imagery of castles, dragons, wizards, and sword and sorcery, perfectly complemented Blackmore's increasingly neoclassical and epic musical compositions. The first three Rainbow albums, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, Rising, and Long Live Rock and Roll, are masterpieces of the genre. Rising in particular is arguably the single greatest artistic statement of Blackmore's career. Tracks like Stargazer and A Light in the Black are breathtaking in their scope and ambition. Symphonic metal before the term even existed, but even in this creative paradise, the tyrant's shadow loomed large. Blackmore's control was absolute. The lineup of Rainbow was a constantly revolving door. Musicians were hired and fired with bewildering frequency, often for the slightest perceived infraction, or simply because Blackmore grew bored. He fired the entire band, save for Dio, after the first album. He would later fire his longtime friend and powerhouse drummer Cozy Powell. He even eventually fired Ronnie James Dio, the voice of his greatest triumphs. The reason? Blackmore felt an irresistible pressure from the record label to pursue a more commercial, radio-friendly sound to compete in the American market. Dio, a man of immense artistic integrity, refused to sing what he considered to be vacuous pop-rock love songs. For Blackmore, the pragmatist and survivor of the Joe Meek era, commercial success was a form of validation. He made a choice. He sacrificed his greatest artistic partner for a shot at the American charts. What followed was the Graham Bonnet era, which produced the hit singles Since You've Been Gone and All Night Long, and then the Joe Lynn Turner era, which pushed the band even further into the slick AOR, album-oriented rock territory of bands like Foreigner and Journey. The music was successful. It sold millions. But for many longtime fans, the magic was gone. The sorcerer was now a popsmith. The fire-breathing dragon had been declawed. Blackmore himself seemed conflicted, often expressing a detached disdain for the very music he was creating. He had achieved the commercial success he sought, but it seemed to leave him artistically unfulfilled. He had built his own perfect kingdom, only to find himself a bored and restless king. The paradox of Ritchie Blackmore is that he seemed incapable of being happy. When he had artistic freedom but no commercial success, he was frustrated. When he had commercial success but compromised artistic freedom, he was contemptuous. He was a man chasing a horizon that constantly receded. This restlessness eventually led to the unthinkable, a reunion of the classic Mk2 lineup of Deep Purple in 1984. The resulting album, Perfect Strangers, was a triumph, both critically and commercially. It seemed for a brief shining moment that the hatchet had been buried. The tour was a massive success, but old habits die hard. By the second album, 1987's The House of Blue Light, the old tensions had resurfaced. The animosity between Blackmore and Gillan was as toxic as ever. The recording sessions were a nightmare, with band members recording their parts separately. Blackmore, once again feeling the creative spark had gone, fired Gillan for a second time, replacing him with his former Rainbow singer, Joe Lynn Turner. This move was deeply unpopular with the other members, the fans, and even the record label. It was a purely dictatorial decision. The resulting album, Slaves and Masters, was derisively nicknamed Deep Rainbow by fans, and is widely considered the nadir of the band's recorded output. The pressure mounted, and for the band's 25th anniversary, management and the label forced Blackmore to swallow his pride and bring Ian Gillan back into the fold once more for the album The Battle Rages On. The title was prophetic. The tour was a disaster of personal relations. Blackmore was distant, sullen, and openly disrespectful to Gillan on stage. He would often finish his solos and walk off, leaving the rest of the band to carry on. Finally, in November 1993, in the middle of a European tour, he quit again, this time for good. He played his last show in Helsinki, Finland, and simply walked away, leaving the band to finish a lucrative Japanese tour with Joe Satriani as a last-minute replacement. His departure was not heroic or principled. It was petulant and deeply unprofessional, a final act of sabotage against the band he co-founded. He left them in an impossible situation, a final, spiteful gesture. And then, something truly strange happened, something nobody could have predicted. The man in black, the hard rock titan, the tyrant of the amplifier, seemed to vanish. He re-emerged with a new project, a new partner, and a new sound that was the absolute antithesis of everything he had built his reputation on. He formed Blackmore'S Night with his then-girlfriend, now wife, the American singer Candace Knight. He traded his Fender Stratocaster for lutes, mandolas, and acoustic guitars. He swapped his leather and denim for velvet and lace. He began playing gentle, melodic, Renaissance-inspired folk music. The transformation was so total, so absolute, that the rock world was left stunned. Was this a joke, a midlife crisis, or was it something else entirely? For the first time in his public life, Ritchie Blackmore appeared content. He seemed genuinely happy playing this music in castles and small theaters for a dedicated niche audience. He had found in Candace Knight not just a musical partner, but a stabilizing force. Someone who seemed to understand and soothe the tormented soul that had driven him for so long. He had, it seemed, finally retreated from the world that had both made him and broken him. He had built a new, smaller, more manageable kingdom, a musical walled garden where he was finally at peace, away from the pressures of fame, the demands of record labels, and the clashing egos of rock and roll. So we are left with the ultimate question, the one we set out to answer. What is the dark secret that Ritchie Blackmore would hate for you to know? It's not that he was a difficult person. We all know that. It's not that he fired people. That's the stuff of legend. The real, uncomfortable truth is far more human and, in a way, more tragic. The truth is that his tyranny, his cruelty, his relentless perfectionism, it all stemmed from a profound and crippling insecurity, an insecurity that manifested as an obsessive need for control. He had to control the music, the band members, the stage, the very atmosphere around him, because he was terrified of what might happen if he didn't. He was terrified of being average, of being the bullied boy in Weston-super-Mare again. He was terrified of the chaos of collaboration, so he chose to be a dictator. His legendary misanthropy wasn't a sign of strength, it was a shield. He pushed people away before they could disappoint him, or worse, reject him. His entire career was a frantic, desperate attempt to build a world he could dominate, to create a sound so powerful and unique that no one could question his genius. The people he hurt along the way were, in his mind, necessary sacrifices for the sake of the art. He wasn't just a monster. He was a deeply wounded man who wore the mask of a monster, because it was the only way he knew how to protect the fragile, brilliant artist within. The switch to Blackmore'S Night wasn't a surrender. It was a final, masterful act of control. He couldn't control the rock world anymore, so he created a new one, a world on his own terms, where he could finally lay down his arms. This does not excuse his behavior. The pain he caused his colleagues was real and lasting, but it does allow us to understand him. It allows us to look at the towering edifice of his musical legacy, from Smoke on the Water to Stargazer, to the gentle melodies of his latter-day work, and see it not just as the work of a genius, but as the lifelong project of a troubled, complex, and ultimately fascinating human being. He built his castle of sound to keep the world out, but in doing so, he invited us all in to marvel at its architecture. That is the enduring, beautiful, and terrible paradox of Ritchie Blackmore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the psyche of a rock legend. This is the kind of storytelling we are dedicated to here at PsychProg. If you found this journey as fascinating as we did, please make sure you are subscribed, that you've liked this video, and that you share it with anyone who appreciates music and the complex souls who create it. It is your support that allows us to continue making these films. Be sure to check out our other videos, where we explore the minds and music of other progressive and psychedelic rock icons. Until next time, keep listening and keep thinking.